The man behind me is one of the most prolific killers who's ever lived. His life and crime served as the inspiration behind some of the most iconic horror villains in history, but a lot of people don't know just how disturbing his life really was. This is the story of Ed Gein. Reminder that I tell a lot of dark true crime stories on this channel, so viewer discretion is advised, but follow along if you'd like to hear more. So there's a lot to cover in this story, so I'm going to split this up according to the characters that he's inspired. So we're going to call this Chapter 1, his Norman Bates era. This is Ed Gein. He was born in 1906. He was the youngest of two brothers, and they lived on an isolated farm in Wisconsin. His family was a red flag personified. His father was kind of a deadbeat alcoholic, but his mother's name was Augusta. She was a deeply troubled and especially intimidating woman who is integral to this story. Ed Gein's relationship with his mother is one of the most extreme examples of maternal influence in criminal psychology. Some things to know about his mother Augusta is that she is deeply religious and she absolutely abhors intimacy. She constantly warned her sons about the dangers of women, and she preached that all women except for herself were instruments of the devil. She berated Ed constantly, calling him weak and worthless, all while reinforcing that she herself was the only person who truly loved and understood him. It's been theorized that Augusta herself had an incredibly traumatic childhood and then projected that onto her sons. It's also been implied that there could have been some SA between Augusta and her son Ed Gein. Now, that's never been proven. However, she was known to encourage Ed to remain a virgin, to remain loyal to her. Needless to say, the psychological and emotional mistreatment Augusta inflicted upon her children created a toxic cycle of dependence where Ed both feared and worshipped his mother. Like he really thought she was a saint. It also affected his unhealthy and pathological relationship with women. So in 1944, things get a little strange. Ed Gein's brother's name was Henry, and Henry did not agree with Ed's assessment of his mother. Henry would question Augusta and constantly criticize her openly in front of Ed, but Ed would never criticize his mother, and he didn't like that Henry was doing it. Then in 1944, Henry dies under suspicious circumstances in a fire. His death was ruled an accident, but Ed Gein was the last person to see him alive. Then the biggest blow of Ed Gein's life happens. His mother dies, which brings us to Chapter 2. When Ed Gein's mother died in 1945, he completely unraveled. He described her death as losing his only friend and his one true love. Which brings us to the next chapter, Chapter 2, The Buffalo Bill Phase. Without his mother, Ed Gein lost the little anchor he had to reality, and we all know that complex trauma, mental illness, and isolation are a bad combination, and his mental state totally deteriorated. So he started to unravel and do strange things. First off, he boarded up his mother's room and created a shrine and left it untouched, but the rest of the house looked like an episode of Hoarders. It was filled with junk and filth. He became fascinated with anatomy books and did research about World War II Yahtzee, medical experiments, grave robbing, and cannibalism. And it's around this time that he started to rob graves. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed Gein develops a hobby of digging up recently deceased and freshly buried women who remind him of his mother, Augusta. But he didn't take jewelry, he would take body parts, like skin, bones, organs, to experiment with. And he started to create some really fucked up things with the things he found. Like he made furniture, like lampshades and chairs that were fashioned from human skin. But something he made that was very noteworthy was a woman's suit out of human skin, because he wanted to become his mother. A common misconception about Ed Gein is that he was scary, when actually he's described as meek and unremarkable and was often used as a babysitter. At some points, the grave robbing wasn't enough for Ed Gein, and like an addict looking for his next fix, his behavior became more extreme and dangerous and led to full-on murder. Which brings us to our third and final chapter, the Leatherface era. In 1954, Mary Hogan, a local bar owner, disappears. She was tough and outspoken, and Ed became weirdly obsessed with her. Her bar was found empty, but there was a pool of blood on the floor. Then in 1957, Ed takes Bernice Worden's life. She was reportedly a buxom woman and reminded Ed of his mother. This was the crime that was his undoing because her son was a local sheriff and Ed was the last person in her store. When authorities searched Ed's farmhouse, it became very clear that he was guilty because they found bowls that were made from skulls, chairs that were made from skin, and Bernice Holden's body decapitated and hung upside down like a deer. I do want to add that Ed Gein's crimes were pretty well documented, and there's a lot of photographic evidence of his creations, including Bernice Worden's body, the way it was discovered. I don't think I can show them here, but they can be found with a quick Google search if you want to do a deeper dive. So what drove Ed Gein to live such a depraved life? Psychologists agree that it's a number of things. For one, there was his traumatic upbringing, his pathological attachment to his mother, and an undiagnosed mental illness, most likely schizophrenia or psychosis. Experts also say that his actions were less about cruelty and more about a desperate and twisted and unhealthy attempt to cope with his loneliness, loss, and grief for his mother. During his trial, Ed Gein was found unfit to stand trial and was committed to a mental institution. He spent the rest of his life in custody, where he was described as quiet, cooperative, and a nice man. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77 of old age. Well, he is the inspiration behind characters like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. His life and crimes should not be romanticized or glorified. What he did was horrible. And he did take 2 women's lives. The next season of Monsters is based off of his life, which I'm very excited to see what they do, because Charlie Hunnam is playing him, and I think it's actually pretty perfect. But his story does show us the dangers that can arise from the combination of isolation, trauma, and unchecked mental illness.